Good afternoon and welcome to The Appeal Live, a co-production of Now This and The Appeal. I'm Alana Sivan, and today we are going to be talking about something called crime-free housing ordinances, which are currently in effect in perhaps thousands of cities and jurisdictions across the United States. Now, the name crime-free housing laws sounds innocuous enough. Crime-free. Everyone wants to live in a place that's safe and free from crime. But the thing is that so many of these ordinances aren't even focused on crime. And like so many measures that say they're focused on reducing crime, they're actually being used to disproportionately target Black and brown tenants and landlords and serve as a tool to impose racial segregation and threaten the health of people of color by attacking their homes or attacking their livelihood by evicting them from their homes. And under many of these laws, something as simple as calling 911 for help could get a tenant labeled as a, quote, nuisance, effectively kicking them out of their home. And so for more on the troubling effects of these so-called crime-free housing ordinances, I am joined today by journalist Cinnamon Janzer and attorney Sam Gedge at the Institute for Justice. So I'll start off today with Sam. Sam, maybe you can start off by explaining the difference between what crime-free housing laws are supposed to do in theory and how they're actually being used in practice.
Sure, and thank you for having me. So the theory behind crime-free housing really dates back to the 1980s. It was produced originally when it came to public housing, and it was intended to give government landlords the power to evict problem tenants. The U.S. Supreme Court upheld that as applied to public landlords to government housing in around 2002. But the court cautioned that the analysis might be a lot different if you have the government acting as sovereign and forcing private landlords in the private sector to kick people out of their homes. A lot of municipalities didn't get that memo, though, so we've seen this spike in what are called crime-free housing laws, where the theory really is that if you or anyone living in your household commits a crime or is even accused of committing a crime, the government can either outright force or pressure your private landlord to evict you and everyone living with you.
So what's really the point here? I mean, it seems like if you have somebody who, because you mentioned it could be somebody else living in your household. So if you have a child, for example, who maybe was arrested or something like that, that's a certain circumstance where their landlord could pressure them to, or they could be pressured to be evicted. Is that the case?
Well, that's exactly right. And it certainly depends on what city you're in. There's a bunch of different kinds of ordinances that fall under the umbrella of crime-free housing. But the most aggressive ones really do put the government in the power of deciding who gets to stay in homes. And what I think makes it particularly unusual and pernicious is not just that it allows the government to punish people based on their association with their family members, but of course it only applies to certain types of people. If you own your home subject to a mortgage, then you can commit all the crimes you want and you're not going to lose your home. These laws really only kick into effect if you happen to rent or if you happen to have what's called a contract for deed. And overwhelmingly, people who fall into those classes tend to be lower income than folks who can afford a down payment or to buy a home outright.
And when you talk about how folks who are renting, or most of these folks are lower income, this makes me think about how, these ordinances are really just a part of a broader set of federal and local housing policies that have disproportionately impacted Black and brown and low income tenants. And so we've seen that throughout the history of this country. So Cinnamon, I'll kick this one to you. Can you talk a little bit about how these laws fit into that pattern of discriminatory housing policies that have been really part of the history of this country for generations?
Yeah, I mean, I think I live in Minneapolis, where there's a project kind of uncovering like racial housing covenants that have like kind of specifically in deeds outlawed like anyone who's not white from buying a house, a specific house or specific property. And I think that this is just like as those things become uncovered and outlawed and there's like fair housing legislation, it's just sort of like another kind of more sneaky way to continue some of these like longer term, more entrenched practices under a new umbrella, under the guise of, like you mentioned in the beginning, like we all want to live in safe housing. But what it really turns out to be in practice is, I think we've seen cases in Faribault, Minnesota, where it's white people calling the police on their Black neighbors, and if the police get called enough, like that person can be evicted, and it can really just be another way to kick some of these people out. And I think a lot of what it does too is it applies a lot of the racial issues that we have in our criminal justice system now over into housing, and we've seen a lot of, you know, what that can do to Black and brown and low income people, and it's just sort of like diffusing that into another area. And you know, I think everyone needs a place to live and should have a right to housing, and makes it very difficult for some people who are already struggling.
So one thing you mentioned is, you know, somebody, a white neighbor calling on their Black neighbor multiple times could be a trigger for someone being evicted. So, for example, if we see, you know, an occasion where somebody is outside and simply a neighbor finds that, you know, finds some sort of issue with some person just existing in their space outside and calls the police enough times, that right there could be something that could end up getting that person evicted.
Yeah, there was a case in Minnesota where a Black family, Black woman was hosting, I believe it was like a child's birthday party outside, and or like her children playing on a trampoline, and the police were called to address that. And under some of these ordinances, which can be known by other names like nuisance-free ordinances and stuff, it's just it can sometimes be just the amount of times that the cops are called or arrive at your residence that can be the trigger. And the problem with that is it doesn't really take into account why the cops can be called. They can be called if someone's having a mental health crisis, if there's domestic abuse happening, and people really need help. You know, a lot of them don't distinguish between that, and so quickly you can see how it becomes very problematic for people, you know, that are struggling already.
And can also erode trust in policing, I imagine, as well, right? If just a simple call to the police could get you kicked out of their home, who's gonna call the police anymore?
Yeah, I mean, and you can imagine, you know, a woman who is suffering domestic abuse, when the choice is either like endure it or call the cops and maybe get kicked out of my house. Like, that's a tough choice. That's a really tough choice to make.
So you've been, I'm gonna stick with you for a second, and then I promise, Sam, I'm coming back to you. So you've been covering crime-free housing ordinances for a while now. So can you talk to us a little bit about how these laws have shifted in the recent years? And then, Sam, I'm going to ask you to answer the same question because I know you've led challenges against some of them. So I'll start with you, Cinnamon, and then I'll jump to you.
Sure. I actually think Sam is probably going to have a better grasp on this than I do. But I mean, in the case of Granite City, which I focused on a little bit, is like through pressure from like Sam's cases and otherwise, like they have since changed the ordinance to where it doesn't really focus on eviction, but it focuses on penalizing landlords who don't comply by increasing like their license fees and things like that. So like you can see them kind of shifting and changing over time, but there's really like a reluctance to actually sort of let those programs go. It's more just like changing the mechanisms by which they work.
Yeah, and just building off that, you know, I think Granite City, Illinois, which Cinnamon mentioned, really is just the perfect case study of how these laws can go so wrong. Granite City is located right across the river from St. Louis, and they've had, you know, what they bill as a crime-free ordinance for 10 or 15 years. And under that ordinance, until they altered it a bit in recent months, it was incredibly punitive, again, targeted exclusively at people who happened to rent or have contract for deeds. And the way it worked was that if you or a member of your household or even a guest really were arrested for any crime, not just on the property, but any crime within the city limits of Granite City, you would get a letter from the crime-free housing officer directed to you and your landlord saying you got to get out. Doesn't matter if you knew about the crime, doesn't matter if you could have prevented it in any way, doesn't matter if your landlord wants to keep you. Granite City would kick you out of your home. And this had devastating impacts on hundreds of families. Over the decade from 2010 to 2020, about 400 to 500 of these notices were issued, which is a lot for a town of a modest size. And Granite City, I think, as I said, is certainly one of the worst examples of crime-free laws in practice, but it's far from the only one. These kinds of laws are common in Illinois, as Cinnamon said, in Minnesota as well, to a lesser degree in Missouri. So, it's great that the problems with these laws are getting a lot more publicity in recent years. The concern, though, I think, again, as Cinnamon alluded to, is that you're seeing cities trying to kind of take away the most pernicious parts of these laws while still keeping the power to pressure landlords to get rid of people who the city or the government just doesn't want in their town.
And let me just really hone in on this for a second. So if somebody is charged with a crime under some of these laws, they go to court, gets completely dismissed, there's no evidence against them, still would fall subject to this law or to some of these laws.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, not just the person who was charged and acquitted or dismissed, their mom, their dad, their brother, their wife, their husband, whoever they happen to live with, or whoever they happen to be staying with when they committed the crime, all these folks could be out on the street. And I think just to drive home why this really isn't about fighting crime, these people can be kicked out of a home they've lived in for years, but many times nothing in the ordinance prevents them from moving across the street. So you hear stories about landlords being reluctantly forced to evict families from their home on threat of fines or losing their license, and the landlord just moves the family to a different property that they own. So all these laws do is just impose costs on landlords, impose costs on tenants, and frequently on the types of people who really can ill afford paying those kinds of costs.
Yeah, I'd really like to build off of that a little bit, because I think obviously the victims are the tenants, but I also, the piece that I wrote for the appeal focused on one of Sam's clients and another landlord who are like these small landlords who have really, like, they're not these giant conglomerates who are making thousands and millions of dollars. They're just these small local landlords who, like, that is their way of life, and they really care about their tenants, and these laws really interfere with that as well. Like, I know, like Sam had mentioned one example, there was a family in Granite City, and they had found a marijuana plant. The cops had found like a marijuana plant, like a singular marijuana plant growing like on their property, like in their yard or something. And they required him to evict him, but he was like on dialysis and had a family, and the landlord really didn't want to do that and enjoyed them as tenants. And so through this long sort of legal process with the city, he ended up just relocating them to another one of his properties. But in the process, the landlord incurred, I think he mentioned, like over $5,000 worth of costs. And at the end of the day, like, dealing with this with the city has had him dig into his like modest savings to sort of make this happen. And now he's like approaching retirement and very unsure of what his future is going to mean. And I think like that just really shows like how far the damage can go.
So many city resources, private landlord resources for one marijuana plant.
Yeah. I mean, it's terrible. It's really sad. And ultimately, like these two landlords in Granite City are sort of have resigned themselves to like they've really tried to put up a fight and really tried to assert that like they feel like their tenants and their rights are being trampled on and they don't want to enforce it. But financially, they can't continue, and it's forced them into this very precarious place. And it's really sad.
So, where do you both see the debate over crime-free housing laws going? What does the legislative landscape look like? Are you both involved in active challenges in other places across the country? On this one, I'll start with you, Sam.
Sure. So we're continuing to challenge Granite City's law on behalf of a couple who was facing eviction until we intervened because one of their adult daughters stole a van in Granite City. As I said, Granite City has tinkered with their law at the margins, we think, in response to getting sued in federal court. We also brought a similar lawsuit against New York City's nuisance abatement law, and that I don't think we would categorize it as a crime-free law, but it was an equally aggressive program where you had the NYPD kicking people out of their homes, shutting down businesses with no notice, simply because there are allegations that somebody committed a crime somewhere in the vicinity. So this is a problem that is not going away, and frequently because it happens at the municipal level, it's almost like a game of whack-a-mole where you have lots of small towns in Illinois, for example, who don't have a lot of public records available and kind of are operating below the radar. and kicking people out of their homes. The people are frequently marginalized, frequently low income, don't have a lot of political power. So this has been going on for a long time without a lot of awareness about it, and it seems poised to continue going on, at least until the courts or a higher legislature gets involved.
Yeah, I think Sam is very much correct, and I think he's got a much better handle on sort of the legislative process of these things. But I've been still in touch with the landlords that I wrote about, and I think, you know, the crime-free issues that they've been dealing with for like over a decade have really set them up poorly to deal with the COVID sort of crisis, and the fact that, like, you know, their sole income is rent, and that's been paused, and so now they have this like momentary relief, but like renters, they're sort of waiting to see what's going to happen when all of this is over, and when these protections and moratoriums on evictions kind of come to a head. And I think like it's ultimately for them, it's made a really bad situation worse.
Both of you for being here and for bringing light to this issue. It's been a pleasure having you.
Thank you so much.
So these crime-free, and I'm putting them in quotations because they're really not focused on getting rid of crime, but these crime-free housing laws seem to take all of these sorts of different forms. Some penalize people for calling police. Some penalize people for having police called on them. Some penalize people for simply having someone in their household who may have been charged with a crime. But all of these housing laws have the same roots and impact, and that's the destabilization and harm to families and individuals, and the displacement of people who are low income and people of color. And they fall into a long history of discriminatory housing policies throughout this country, and they continue to affect people's lives. And something that really struck me when speaking with Cinnamon and Sam is just how useless they are and how many resources they take away from other things that could keep people safe. Like, instead of investing all of this time for kicking people out of their homes, all of this money into kicking people out of their homes, all of that money could be invested into properly giving a good housing structure and support for people in their neighborhoods. And also thinking about the sort of mistrust that this breeds in police departments. Who is going to call the police for help if you're in an abusive relationship, for example, if that call is going to get you kicked out of your home? But luckily, there are attorneys and activists who are challenging these ordinances and working to make their housing systems more equitable, more safe, and less discriminatory. So thank you all for joining us today on The Appeal Live. I'm Alana Sivan. You can continue to follow us on Facebook and Twitter for the latest news. We will see you next time.